Disclaimer.
G here, and as the Asian guy covering American finance, this story hits different. We're debating Greenland while sitting on more rare earths than the island even has, and nobody's connecting the dots. Picture this scenario. You're watching politicians debate spending billions to control an island covered in ice, claiming we desperately need its rare earth minerals for our national security. Meanwhile, right here in Wyoming, there's a deposit so massive it could reshape global supply chains, sitting untouched on American soil. Something doesn't add up. Here's what should grab our attention. The United States Geological Survey released data in January 2025, confirming something remarkable about our rare earth reserves. America holds between 1.9 and 2.4 million metric tons of these critical minerals within our borders. Greenland, the island dominating recent headlines, contains an estimated 1.5 million metric tons. Let me repeat that with clarity. We already have more rare earths than the place politicians insist we need to control. This creates an obvious question that no one seems to be asking publicly. If we're sitting on larger reserves than Greenland, why all the political theater about acquiring Arctic territory? The answer reveals something far more important about our economic future than most Americans realize. Think about what rare earth elements actually power in your daily life. Your smartphone contains 17 different rare earth metals. Every electric vehicle battery depends on neodymium and dysprosium for the motors that make them run. Wind turbines use hundreds of pounds of these materials per unit. Military defense systems, from fighter jets to precision-guided missiles, require rare earth magnets that simply can't be manufactured without these elements. We're not talking about luxury items or optional technology anymore. These minerals underpin the infrastructure of modern American life. Now here's where the story gets interesting, and where understanding the real game becomes crucial for anyone watching their investment portfolio or thinking about our economic security. In 2024, geologists disclosed detailed findings about a site called Halleck Creek in southeastern Wyoming. The deposit potentially contains 2.34 billion metric tons of ore, making it the fifth largest rare earth deposit ever discovered anywhere on the planet. To put that in perspective, that's enough raw material to supply American industrial needs for decades, possibly centuries, depending on processing efficiency and demand growth. Wyoming isn't some remote wilderness without infrastructure either. We're talking about a location with existing roads, rail connections, and established mining expertise in the region. The deposit sits in an area where companies already know how to extract resources from the ground efficiently. Yet while politicians generate headlines about Greenland's strategic importance, Halleck Creek remains largely undeveloped, almost invisible in the national conversation about resource independence. You might be thinking that maybe we just don't produce rare earths at all, that perhaps we've never figured out how to mine them successfully on American soil. That assumption would be completely wrong, and understanding why reveals the actual problem we're facing. California's Mountain Pass mine, located in the Mojave Desert about 60 miles south of Las Vegas, currently produces approximately 45,000 metric tons of rare earth materials annually. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, that output represents 11.5% of total global production, making America the world's second largest rare earth producer right now, trailing only China. Mountain Pass operates as proof of concept that American rare earth mining works at commercial scale. The facility processes ore, extracts the valuable elements, and ships concentrate to customers. The mine employs American workers, generates economic activity in California, and produces materials that meet international quality standards. Everything about the operation demonstrates that we possess the geological knowledge, the engineering capability, and the workforce skills to extract these minerals from our own territory successfully. So here's the puzzle that should make every American pause and reconsider what we're really being told about rare earth supply chains. We produce 45,000 metric tons annually from Mountain Pass. We hold reserves exceeding Greenland's. We've got potentially billions of tons sitting in Wyoming. Yet somehow, 80% of our rare earth consumption still depends on imports. How does that math possibly work? The answer exposes a vulnerability that acquisition of Greenland does absolutely nothing to solve. Those rare earth materials coming out of Mountain Pass get shipped overseas for processing. That's right, we dig them out of American ground, then send them to other countries, primarily China, where they get refined into the usable forms that manufacturers actually need. Then we buy many of those processed materials back as finished components in products ranging from electronics to defense equipment. Think about that supply chain for a moment and imagine any other industry accepting such a bizarre arrangement. It's like we're growing wheat on American farms, shipping it to Asia for milling into flour, then importing bread at marked up prices while wondering why we can't achieve food security. The comparison might sound absurd, but that's essentially what we've constructed with rare earth elements, and the consequences reach far beyond simple economics. This processing gap creates genuine national security concerns that go well beyond the usual political talking points. When tensions rise between major powers, Control over processing facilities matters infinitely more than control over mines. You can't build a fighter jet motor with raw ore straight from the ground any more than you can build a house with trees still standing in the forest. The processing, the refining, the transformation of raw materials into precision manufactured components, that's where the actual power lies in modern supply chains. The situation becomes even more striking when you examine the specific steps required to transform rare earth ore into usable products. After mining, the ore must be crushed and concentrated. Then comes chemical separation, where individual rare earth elements get isolated from each other through complex processes involving acids and solvents. Next comes purification to reach the purity levels demanded by manufacturers, sometimes requiring purity rates of 99.9% or higher. Finally comes the production of alloys and magnets, where rare earth metals get combined with other materials to create the permanent magnets that power everything from electric vehicles to wind turbines to missile guidance systems. China has spent 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building the world's most sophisticated rare earth processing infrastructure. They didn't do this by accident or through market forces alone. According to industry analysts, Chinese government policies deliberately undercut global competitors throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, pricing rare earth exports below production costs to drive foreign processors out of business. The strategy worked devastatingly well. One by one, American and European processing facilities closed their doors, unable to compete with subsidized Chinese prices. By the time Western governments recognized the strategic implications, the industrial knowledge, the specialized workforce, and the physical infrastructure for rare earth processing had largely migrated to Asia. So while our attention gets directed toward frozen tundra and sovereignty debates about Greenland, the actual rare earth challenge facing America sits in broad daylight, completely unrelated to territorial acquisition. We've got the rocks. We've always had the rocks. What we lack is the industrial capacity to transform those rocks into the magnets, catalysts, and alloys that our economy and military depend on every single day. And that gap between mining and manufacturing represents one of the most significant asymmetric opportunities in modern industrial history for those who understand what's really happening beneath the political noise. Let's talk about what acquiring Greenland would actually mean in practical terms, because once you see the numbers, the entire narrative falls apart. Greenland currently has 0 operating rare earth mines, not one active extraction site producing commercial quantities of these materials. The island spans 836,000 square miles, but approximately 80% of that territory sits buried under permanent ice sheets averaging over a mile thick. The remaining 20% consists largely of exposed rock and tundra where temperatures allow mining operations for maybe 6 months per year, assuming everything goes perfectly with weather and logistics. Now consider what building a rare earth mine in that environment actually requires. You need to construct ports capable of handling heavy equipment and ore shipments in waters that freeze solid for half the year. You need power generation facilities, because Greenland's tiny electrical grid serves just 57,000 residents scattered across coastal settlements. You need housing, roads, water treatment, waste management, and all the supporting infrastructure that makes industrial operations possible. According to mining industry experts who've evaluated Arctic projects, we're talking about billions upon billions of dollars invested over decades, just to reach the point where the first ton of ore comes out of the ground. But here's where the economics become truly problematic for anyone suggesting Greenland represents a solution to our rare earth challenges. The ore grades matter enormously in mining economics. Mountain Pass in California processes ore with rare earth oxide content around 8%, which makes the operation economically viable at current prices. The most promising Greenland deposit, the Kvanefjeld project that's been studied extensively, shows ore grades around 1.4% rare earth oxides. Think about what that difference means in practical terms. You need to move roughly 6 times as much rock in Greenland to extract the same amount of rare earth material you'd get from California. And you're doing it in an environment where every aspect of operations costs multiples of what it would cost in accessible locations. The Kvanefjeld project has been studied and debated in Greenland for over a decade. Environmental concerns about radioactive elements present in the ore body led Greenland's government to ban uranium mining in 2021, effectively killing the project despite years of development work and hundreds of millions in investment. That decision reflects local sovereignty, which brings up an uncomfortable truth that rarely enters American political discussions about Greenland. The island has home rule government with control over natural resources. Even if territorial acquisition happens somehow, resource development would still require working with local authorities and populations who've already demonstrated they'll prioritize environmental concerns over extraction economics. Let's shift attention to where the real bottleneck exists, because this is where understanding the supply chain creates opportunity for those paying attention. China doesn't just mine rare earths more than everyone else combined. They control 94% of global permanent magnet production, according to data from the U.S. Department of Energy released in 2024. Those magnets, specifically neodymium iron boron magnets and samarium cobalt magnets, are what actually matter for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and defense applications. You can own all the rare earth mines on the planet, but if you can't turn those elements into precision manufactured magnets, you own nothing but expensive rocks. The processing dominance extends even further when you examine the full supply chain. China controls approximately 90% of rare earth refining capacity globally. They've built specialized facilities for every step of the process, from initial separation to final purification. When rare earth ore leaves Mountain Pass in California, it gets shipped to China for processing, because we literally don't have the facilities to handle it domestically at commercial scale. The irony should be obvious. We're mining materials for our own national security. Then sending them to the one country everyone agrees poses the greatest strategic challenge to American interests, then buying them back as finished components at marked up prices. In April 2025, China demonstrated exactly how much power this processing dominance provides. The Chinese government announced export restrictions on 7 heavy rare earth elements, including dysprosium and terbium, which are critical for high-performance magnets used in military applications. These weren't mining restrictions. China wasn't limiting how much they pulled from the ground. They restricted exports of processed, refined materials ready for manufacturing. The message came through perfectly clear to anyone in the industry. Owning deposits means nothing without processing infrastructure. Control over refineries trumps control over mines every single time in modern supply chains. The market response to those export restrictions revealed something crucial about how quickly our dependency can translate into price volatility and supply uncertainty. Western buyers scrambled to secure alternative sources for the restricted materials. Prices for dysprosium oxide jumped 40% within weeks in non-Chinese markets, according to industry pricing data. Defense contractors started reporting concerns about securing materials for contracted projects. The Biden administration accelerated funding discussions for domestic processing infrastructure that had been moving slowly through bureaucratic channels. One policy announcement from Beijing exposed just how vulnerable our entire manufacturing base had become through decades of outsourcing decisions that seemed economically rational at the time, but created strategic fragility we're only now beginning to fully comprehend. You want to understand how seriously our government actually takes this processing gap? Look at where the money's really going, because that tells you what decision makers believe when political speeches end and resource allocation begins. In July 2025, the Department of Defense announced a $400 million commitment to MP Materials, the company operating Mountain Pass mine, specifically to build rare earth processing and magnet manufacturing facilities in Texas and California. The contract includes price support guarantees where DoD agrees to purchase materials at $110 per kilogram, approximately $50 above prevailing market prices at the time the agreement was signed. Let that sink in for a moment. Our military is willing to pay nearly double market rates to ensure domestic processing capacity comes online, because they've run the calculations and determined that price premium is worth it for supply chain security. The Pentagon doesn't make $400 million commitments to feel good about theoretical concerns. That funding represents a strategic judgment that processing capability matters more than access to raw materials, and that China's current dominance over processing creates unacceptable risks for everything from F-35 fighter jets to Virginia-class submarines to next-generation missile defense systems. The timeline matters here too, because it exposes just how far behind we've fallen and how long rebuilding will take, even with massive government support. MP Materials expects their Texas facility to reach 10,000 metric tons of magnet production capacity by 2028 if everything proceeds on schedule. That would represent the first meaningful rare earth magnet manufacturing capability in the United States in over a decade. But here's the sobering context. China currently produces over 200,000 metric tons of rare earth magnets annually. Our most ambitious domestic project, fully funded by the Department of Defense, will reach 5% of current Chinese capacity by the end of this decade if everything goes perfectly. These numbers illustrate why the Greenland debate misses the entire point of our rare earth challenge. Adding more mining capacity, whether in Greenland or Wyoming or anywhere else, does nothing to address the processing gap that actually constrains our supply chain. It's like responding to a semiconductor shortage by opening more sand quarries. Sure, you need silicon dioxide to make chips, but the bottleneck isn't access to sand. It's the multi-billion-dollar fabrication facilities that turn sand into working processors. The same logic applies to rare earths. We've got plenty of material in the ground right now. What we lack is the industrial infrastructure to transform that material into the components our economy needs. The geopolitical calculation gets even more complex when you consider how China might respond to aggressive American moves to secure alternative rare earth deposits. If the United States pursued Greenland acquisition while simultaneously threatening tariffs or other trade restrictions, Beijing has every incentive to further restrict rare earth exports, particularly processed materials. They know we can't replace their processing capacity quickly. They know our defense contractors depend on materials that only Chinese refineries produce in commercial quantities. The leverage exists right now, today, regardless of what happens with Greenland or any other mining development, because the leverage comes from processing dominance, not mining dominance. This is where understanding the real supply chain dynamics separates informed investors from people chasing headlines. The next decade in rare earths isn't about who controls the most deposits. It's about who can build processing infrastructure fastest while navigating the political and economic realities of breaking Chinese dominance over refining and manufacturing. Companies working on domestic processing represent asymmetric opportunities because they're solving the actual problem while most attention focuses on the wrong part of the supply chain entirely. Pop quiz. If you had to choose between owning a rare earth mine in Greenland that wouldn't produce anything for a decade, or owning processing facilities in Texas that will be supplying the U.S. military by 2028, which asset would you rather control? The answer reveals everything you need to know about where the real value lies in this industry. We're watching a masterclass in misdirection, where political theater about territorial acquisition distracts from the industrial transformation that is already underway with government backing and guaranteed customers. Now let's talk about the timeline that really matters, because this is where understanding the industrial realities separates speculation from strategic investment thinking. MP Materials isn't just planning to build processing capacity. They've committed to what they call the 10X facility in Fort Worth, Texas, designed to produce 10,000 metric tons of rare earth magnets annually by 2028. The name refers to their goal of increasing American magnet production capacity by a factor of 10 compared to current domestic output, which is essentially zero at commercial scale right now. This facility represents the first serious attempt to rebuild American rare earth manufacturing capability in over 20 years. The project includes separation facilities to refine rare earth concentrate into individual elements, metal production to create rare earth alloys, and magnet manufacturing to produce the finished neodymium iron boron magnets that electric vehicles and wind turbines require. Every step happens on American soil, eliminating the vulnerability of shipping materials to China for processing. The Department of Defense funding guarantees customers and revenue, removing much of the commercial risk that has prevented private investment in rare earth processing for decades. But here's what should make you pause and consider the magnitude of what we're actually attempting to accomplish. China has spent 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building their rare earth processing dominance. They've trained thousands of specialized workers, developed proprietary techniques for efficient separation and purification, and constructed integrated supply chains where waste from one process becomes feedstock for another. The environmental regulations they've operated under during that development period allowed practices that would never be permitted in the United States today, giving them cost advantages that persist even as they've tightened standards more recently. MP Materials' 10,000 metric ton facility by 2028 represents meaningful progress, but you need context to appreciate both the achievement and the limitations. China currently produces approximately 220,000 metric tons of rare earth magnets every year. Our most ambitious project, fully funded by military spending with guaranteed pricing, will reach roughly 4.5% of Chinese capacity 3 years from now if everything proceeds perfectly on schedule. And that's assuming no technical delays, no permitting challenges, no workforce shortages, and no unexpected complications in scaling up processes that work at lab scale but prove difficult at commercial production levels. Think about what this timeline means for the Greenland debate specifically. Even if we started developing Greenland rare earth mines today with unlimited funding and no environmental or political obstacles, those mines would not produce significant output until the mid-2030s, at the earliest, based on typical Arctic mining development timelines. Meanwhile, our processing bottleneck would still exist completely unchanged. We'd be adding raw material supply to a system that can't handle the material we're already producing. It's like buying more ingredients when the problem is you don't have enough ovens. The market has already started pricing in the reality of bifurcated rare earth supply chains, and the numbers reveal something crucial about the premium Western manufacturers will pay for non-Chinese sources. In September 2025, trading data showed dysprosium oxide from non-Chinese sources selling at approximately 3 times the price of Chinese material in European and American markets. This wasn't a temporary spike or short-term supply disruption. The premium reflects a structural shift where Western buyers are willing to pay significantly more for materials that don't come with potential supply chain interruption risks attached. That 3 times premium creates fascinating economics for any company that can produce rare earths outside China with reasonable efficiency. You don't need to match Chinese production costs to be profitable. You need to operate somewhere between Chinese prices and the premium Western buyers are already paying, which creates a substantial margin even for less efficient operations. This is the arbitrage opportunity that government funding recognizes and supports. The Pentagon isn't trying to compete with China on cost. They're willing to guarantee above-market prices because supply security matters more than marginal cost differences for military procurement. Let's zoom out and consider the full strategic calculation facing American policymakers and industry leaders over the next decade. According to analysis from the Department of Energy and independent industry consultants, the United States needs 10 to 15 years minimum to develop rare earth processing capability that could genuinely compete with Chinese infrastructure at commercial scale. That timeline assumes consistent funding, successful technology development, workforce training programs that actually produce qualified workers, and environmental permitting that balances industrial needs against legitimate concerns about chemical processes. Those 10 to 15 years represent the real battlefield for rare earth independence, regardless of what happens with Greenland or any other deposit. The companies that successfully build and scale processing facilities during this period will capture enormous value because they'll be supplying a market where Western buyers are desperate for alternatives to Chinese sources and willing to pay premium prices. The geographical location of rare earth deposits becomes almost irrelevant in this calculation. What matters is who can build refineries and magnet factories that actually work at commercial scale. Wyoming's Halleck Creek deposit sits in the western United States with existing infrastructure nearby. Road access already exists. Rail connections could be expanded relatively easily. The climate allows year-round operations. Permitting happens through established American regulatory processes that, while sometimes slow, at least operate with predictable rules. Compare that to Greenland, where you're building everything from scratch in an Arctic environment with 6-month operating seasons and environmental sensitivities that have already killed one major project. From a pure industrial logic perspective, accelerating Wyoming development makes infinitely more sense than pursuing Greenland if the goal is actually securing rare earth supplies for American industry. But here's what makes the whole situation almost darkly humorous if the stakes weren't so serious. While American attention focuses on territorial debates and mining locations, China continues strengthening their processing advantage. They're not sitting still waiting for us to catch up. Chinese companies are investing in next-generation separation technologies, improving magnet performance, and developing recycling processes that could give them access to rare earth materials from end-of-life products like old computers and electric vehicles. They're playing the long game on processing technology while we're still debating where to dig holes in the ground. The companies positioned to win over the next decade are those solving actual bottlenecks rather than theoretical problems. MP Materials building magnets in Texas solves a bottleneck. Linus Rare Earths. Constructing processing facilities in Australia and Texas solves a bottleneck. Research programs developing more efficient separation chemistry solve bottlenecks. Opening a mine in Greenland solves nothing that isn't already solved by existing deposits in the United States, Australia, and other allied countries. The constraint isn't ore access. It's never been ore access. The constraint is the industrial capacity to transform ore into usable products. Here's the calculation every investor and policy observer needs to understand clearly. The rare earth supply chain is splitting into Chinese and non-Chinese segments with different pricing, different supply security, and different strategic implications. Western manufacturers will increasingly source from non-Chinese suppliers, regardless of cost premiums, because supply reliability matters more than marginal savings. That market segmentation creates opportunity for companies building non-Chinese processing capacity, but it takes time measured in years or decades, not months. Your investment portfolio implications should be obvious by now. Mining companies developing Greenland or Arctic deposits face astronomical costs, decade-long timelines, and environmental challenges that could kill projects even after billions in investment. Processing companies building facilities in Texas, California, or other established industrial locations face technical challenges, but they're working in environments with existing infrastructure, available workforce, and clear government support through guaranteed customers and pricing. Which risk profile looks more attractive for capturing value from rare earth supply chain restructuring? The geopolitical calculation points the same direction. America rebuilding rare earth processing doesn't threaten China's mining operations. We're not trying to shut down their deposits. We're trying to create alternatives to their processing dominance, which reduces their leverage without requiring confrontation over resources. Every ton of rare earth magnets produced in Fort Worth instead of Guangdong reduces Chinese leverage by a measurable amount. Every military contractor that secures domestic supply sources becomes slightly less vulnerable to export restrictions. This is how you actually build supply chain resilience through industrial capacity rather than territorial control. So let me bring this full circle to where we started because the contrast between perception and reality has rarely been starker in modern industrial policy. Politicians debate Greenland while the actual solution sits in Fort Worth, Texas, and Mountain Pass, California, and dozens of research labs where scientists work on separation chemistry improvements. The headlines focus on territorial acquisition, while the real battle happens in magnet factories and refining processes that most Americans couldn't even locate on a map. The race isn't for rocks anymore, if it ever really was. The race is for refineries, for processing capacity, for the industrial knowledge of how to transform raw materials into precision manufactured components. China won that race decisively over the past 3 decades through strategic planning and massive investment. America is attempting a comeback through government-funded processing facilities and supply chain restructuring. The outcome of that industrial competition will determine rare earth supply security far more than who controls Greenland or any other deposit. We're watching our country finally address a vulnerability that's been building for 30 years, but the solution requires understanding where the actual problem exists. Every dollar spent pursuing Greenland mining is a dollar not spent on processing infrastructure that could be operational by 2028. Every political debate about Arctic sovereignty is time not spent accelerating permitting for Wyoming deposits that could supply American refineries without shipping ore across oceans. The misdirection would almost be impressive if the consequences were not so significant for our industrial base and national security. For those of us watching these dynamics unfold and thinking about how to position ourselves in a world of bifurcating supply chains and strategic competition, the implications are clear. The value lies downstream from the mine. It lies in the processing facilities, in the magnet manufacturers, in the companies solving the actual bottlenecks rather than addressing theoretical concerns about deposit access. America has more rare earths than Greenland. We've always had enough rare earths. What we haven't had is the industrial infrastructure to transform those materials into the components our economy requires. That infrastructure is being rebuilt right now with government support and guaranteed customers. The companies executing that rebuilding successfully will capture enormous value over the next decade as Western manufacturers increasingly source from non-Chinese suppliers regardless of cost premiums. Meanwhile, political debates about Greenland will continue generating headlines while remaining essentially irrelevant to the actual industrial transformation that determines our rare earth future. Understanding the difference between the headline story and the real story separates those who profit from industrial transitions from those who simply watch them unfold while focused on the wrong part of the supply chain entirely. The rocks were never the problem. The rocks were never the solution. The real story, as always, lies in the factories. Thanks for sticking with me through the entire supply chain. Most people check out after the first mine. If this shifted how you see the Greenland headlines, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering what's really moving beneath the noise. AG out.